Most people believe budgeting is supposed to solve their financial stress, yet somehow they still feel broke even after carefully tracking every dollar they spend each month. You might sit down at the beginning of the month, open a spreadsheet, assign numbers to every category, and feel confident that this time everything will finally work. But by the second week, something already feels off, because small expenses start creeping in, and the numbers you wrote down suddenly stop matching reality. By the end of the month, the budget looks completely broken, and you begin wondering whether budgeting even works for normal people at all. Here is the interesting part, though, because the real problem usually is not your income, your discipline, or even your spending habits. The real problem is that most people unknowingly build budgets around several hidden mistakes that almost guarantee the system will eventually collapse. These mistakes are incredibly common, and millions of people repeat them every single month without realizing they are sabotaging their own financial plans. So in this video, I want to walk through some of the most common budgeting mistakes people make and explain exactly how to fix them. And once you understand these mistakes, you will realize that budgeting is not about restriction or punishment the way many people think. Instead, budgeting becomes something much more powerful, which is a system that helps you control where your money goes instead of wondering where it disappeared. But before we get into the solutions, we need to start with the biggest budgeting mistake that quietly ruins financial plans before the month even begins. The first mistake people make is creating budgets that look perfect on paper but completely unrealistic in real-life situations. Many budgeting guides encourage people to assign very strict numbers to every spending category in order to maximize savings and eliminate waste. So someone might decide they will only spend a small amount on eating out, entertainment, shopping, and other lifestyle categories. At the start of the month, that decision feels smart, responsible, and financially disciplined. But real life is rarely predictable. And that is where these strict budgets start falling apart. Maybe a friend invites you to dinner one evening, or coworkers suggest going out for drinks after work during a stressful week. Suddenly, you face a choice between sticking to the budget or participating in normal social experiences that make life enjoyable. Most people eventually choose the experience, which immediately pushes the budget out of alignment with the numbers written down earlier. After that first small break in the system, it becomes much easier to ignore the budget completely for the rest of the month. This is why extremely strict budgets often fail even when the person using them genuinely wants to manage their money better. The system is not failing because you lack discipline, but because the design never accounted for how human behavior actually works. A budget that requires perfect behavior every single day is not really a financial plan. It is just a temporary experiment waiting to collapse. But here is the good news, because fixing this mistake is actually much easier than most people think. Instead of creating rigid spending limits that cannot adapt to real-life situations, you can build flexible spending ranges. For example, instead of deciding you will spend exactly $100 on dining out every month, you might create a range between $80 and $150. This small change makes your budget more realistic because it acknowledges that some months naturally include more social events than others. It also prevents the psychological effect where one small mistake causes the entire budgeting system to feel broken. When you give yourself controlled flexibility inside the budget, the system becomes much easier to follow consistently over time. And consistency is far more important than perfection when it comes to building healthy financial habits. A budget that works 80% of the time for many years will always outperform a perfect budget that collapses after 2 months. But while unrealistic spending limits are one common mistake, another budgeting problem hides deeper inside the calendar itself. Many people forget to include irregular expenses that only appear a few times each year but still impact their finances significantly. These are expenses like annual subscriptions, holiday gifts, car repairs, medical bills, or insurance payments that arrive unexpectedly. When these costs appear, they feel like financial emergencies, even though they were completely predictable all along. And when a budget fails to account for these expenses, the entire financial plan suddenly looks inaccurate and unreliable. That is when people often say, budgeting does not work. even though the real issue was simply incomplete planning. Understanding this mistake is important because it leads directly to one of the most powerful tools in personal finance. And this is where something called sinking funds can quietly transform the way your entire budget operates. Now let's talk about one of the most frustrating budgeting moments that almost everyone experiences at some point during their financial journey. Everything seems to be going smoothly for several weeks, and your spending appears perfectly aligned with the numbers you originally planned. Then suddenly a large expense appears that you completely forgot to include when building the budget earlier that month. Maybe your car needs a repair, your yearly subscription renews, or a family event requires travel expenses you did not expect. Even though these situations are normal parts of life, they often feel like financial emergencies when the budget never prepared for them. This is one of the most common budgeting mistakes people make, and it has nothing to do with spending discipline or financial intelligence. The real problem is that traditional monthly budgets often ignore expenses that do not occur every single month. But here is the important realization. Because irregular expenses are still predictable, even if they appear only occasionally, things like holiday gifts, car maintenance, insurance payments, and annual subscriptions happen repeatedly over long periods of time. When these costs are ignored inside a budget, the system creates an illusion that you have more money available than you actually do. Then, when the expense finally arrives, the budget suddenly looks inaccurate and unreliable, even though the mistake happened during the planning stage. This is exactly where a strategy called sinking funds becomes incredibly useful for stabilizing your financial system. A sinking fund is simply a small amount of money you set aside every month for a future expense you know will eventually arrive. For example, imagine your car insurance costs $600 each year when the annual payment comes due. Instead of scrambling to find $600 during that month, you can simply set aside $50 each month. After 12 months, you will already have the full amount saved, which means the expense never disrupts your budget again. This same strategy can apply to dozens of different expenses that quietly appear throughout the year. You might create sinking funds for travel, gifts, home repairs, technology upgrades, or medical costs that are not covered by insurance. Over time, these funds transform irregular expenses into predictable monthly planning items. Once that happens, your budget becomes much more stable because fewer surprises can throw the system off balance. But here is where another interesting budgeting mistake often appears once people begin tracking their spending more carefully. Many people believe that simply tracking every expense will automatically improve their financial behavior. They download budgeting apps, connect their bank accounts, categorize purchases, and monitor their spending every single day. At first, this process feels incredibly productive because you suddenly gain visibility into where your money is going. You might discover that you spend more on food delivery than expected, or that small daily purchases add up quickly. However, awareness alone rarely creates lasting behavioral change when it comes to personal finance decisions. You can know exactly where your money goes every month and still continue repeating the same spending habits anyway. This happens because knowledge does not automatically override convenience, emotions, or impulsive decisions in daily life. Human behavior tends to follow the path of least resistance, especially when financial choices happen quickly throughout the day. If your financial system requires constant discipline and decision-making, eventually your motivation will begin fading over time. This is why successful budgeting systems often rely on automation and environment design rather than constant self-control. For example, many people automate transfers that move money directly into savings accounts immediately after receiving their paycheck. When savings happen automatically before spending decisions occur, the temptation to skip saving becomes much weaker. Another powerful strategy involves creating small amounts of friction for purchases that are not aligned with your priorities. You might remove stored credit cards from online stores, unsubscribe from promotional emails, or create a waiting period before larger purchases. These small environmental changes may seem simple, but they dramatically influence how spending decisions unfold in everyday life. Instead of relying entirely on discipline, the system itself begins guiding your behavior toward better financial outcomes. But there is still one more subtle budgeting mistake that quietly affects how people emotionally experience their financial plans. Many individuals treat budgeting as a form of restriction rather than a tool for intentional resource allocation. They see the budget as a list of things they are not allowed to buy, instead of a plan for how money supports their priorities. This mindset can make budgeting feel exhausting because every purchase feels like breaking a rule or violating a financial diet. And when budgeting feels emotionally negative, people naturally abandon the system after only a few difficult months. But once you change the way you think about budgeting, the entire experience begins feeling completely different. Once people begin treating budgeting as restriction, they unknowingly turn their financial plan into something that constantly fights against their normal lifestyle desires. Every purchase begins to feel like a negotiation between what the budget allows and what you actually want in the moment. Over time, that tension slowly drains motivation because the system feels more like punishment than a tool for building a better life. But here is where a powerful mental shift can completely transform how budgeting feels and how well it actually works. A budget is not supposed to stop you from spending money, because spending money is one of the main purposes of earning it. Instead, a budget is simply a plan that ensures your money supports the things that genuinely matter most to you. When you begin looking at budgeting this way, the process becomes much less about restriction and much more about intentional decision-making. For example, someone might decide they truly value travel experiences much more than frequent restaurant meals during busy work weeks. Instead of feeling guilty about spending money on vacations, they intentionally allocate more of their budget toward travel each year. At the same time, they might reduce spending on things that provide less long-term satisfaction in their daily routine. Nothing about this approach feels restrictive because the spending choices are aligned with personal priorities rather than arbitrary limits. This shift turns budgeting into something closer to resource allocation rather than financial dieting. But there is still one final insight that explains why so many people abandon budgeting completely after a few frustrating months. Most people believe successful budgeting depends primarily on discipline, motivation, and constant attention to spending decisions. They imagined financially responsible people carefully monitoring every dollar with perfect consistency throughout the entire year. However, the truth is that most sustainable financial systems rely much more on design than on daily discipline. In other words, the structure of your financial system matters far more than your moment-to-moment motivation. If your money automatically flows toward savings, investments, and essential expenses before discretionary spending even begins, the system becomes much easier to maintain. Instead of fighting your impulses constantly, you simply operate inside a structure that already protects your long-term financial priorities. Some people call this approach a money flow system because it focuses on where money moves automatically rather than tracking every single transaction manually. For example, a paycheck might automatically distribute money into separate accounts for bills, savings, sinking funds, and spending. Once those transfers happen, the remaining money becomes safe to spend without worrying about accidentally harming your financial stability. This kind of system dramatically reduces financial stress because most important decisions were already made when the structure was designed. Instead of asking yourself whether you can afford something every time you spend money, the system already answered that question earlier. And this is where budgeting quietly transforms from a stressful monthly task into a supportive background process in your financial life. You are no longer trying to control every dollar manually because the system itself guides your money in the right directions. At that point, budgeting stops feeling like work and starts feeling more like a framework that supports your long-term goals. And when a financial system feels supportive instead of restrictive, people are far more likely to continue using it for many years. The truth is that most budgeting failures are not caused by lack of intelligence, discipline, or financial knowledge. They usually happen because the system was built around unrealistic assumptions about human behavior and everyday life. But once you fix a few key mistakes, budgeting becomes dramatically easier and far more sustainable over time. Flexible spending ranges allow real life to happen without breaking the entire financial plan. Sinking funds prepare your budget for irregular expenses that would otherwise feel like unexpected emergencies. Automation and environmental design reduce the amount of discipline required to make responsible financial decisions consistently. And most importantly, reframing budgeting as intentional resource allocation removes the emotional resistance that causes many people to quit. When these ideas come together, budgeting stops being something you fight against every month. Instead, it becomes a quiet financial structure that gradually improves your stability, confidence, and long-term wealth. And the surprising part is that none of these changes require earning more money or making extreme sacrifices in your lifestyle. Often, the biggest financial improvements come from fixing small structural mistakes that quietly influenced your money decisions for years. So if budgeting has felt frustrating or ineffective in the past, the problem may never have been your discipline or financial ability. It may simply mean the system needed a few adjustments so it could work with your behavior instead of constantly fighting against it. And once that alignment happens, managing your money becomes much simpler than most people ever expect.